Okay, guys, this is it. It is finally time for me to release my top 100 ranked players for the 2022 NHL draft. And oh my gosh, was this so much more difficult than I thought. A lot of these guys are just really close to each other. So, especially once you're outside the top, really as early as the top 20, I think a lot of these guys can be anywhere from 5, 10, 15, maybe even like 20 spots higher or lower, depending on various people's opinions. So this is just my list. And yeah, so I'm going to be specifically talking about the top 50, but I will go over my 51 to 100 as well. I'm just going to list them. And normally, I don't ask you guys to like the video until the end, but this video did take me quite a long time, or I should say this list took me quite a long time to compile and finalize. So if you guys do enjoy it, please do give it a like. That'd really help me out. That being said, number 100, left winger Alexander Perevalov. 99, goaltender Topias Lenonen. At 98, defenseman Garrett Brown. 97, centerman Ryger Lorenz. 96, left winger Kirill Dolzenkov. 95, defenseman Otto Salin. 94, defenseman Maverick Lamoureux. 93, centerman Gustav Carlson. 92, centerman Zam Plant. 91, forward Nikita Boldarov. 90, centerman Ryan Green. 89, left winger Matthew Semenoff. 88, defenseman Rodwin Rionicio. 87, centerman Cedric Guindon. 86, centerman Matthew Poitras. 85, centerman Topi Loroni. 84, left winger Owen Van Steensel, one of the best names in the draft. 83, goalie Tyler Brennan. 82, right winger Devin Kaplan. 81, right winger Jack Devine. 80, left winger Bo Jelsma. 79, right winger Jordan Dumais. 78, forward Victor Nuchev. 77, defenseman Hudson Thornton. 76, left winger Yanni Nyman. 75, centerman slash left winger Ilya Kovchko. 74, centerman Samuel Savoy. 73, defenseman Simon Forsmark. 72, centerman Luca Delbel Beluz. 71, defenseman Tomas Hamara. 70, defenseman Alexander Pelavin. 69, defenseman Mats Lindgren. 68, defenseman Ryan Healy. 67, forward Fraser Minton. 66, centerman Cameron Lund. 65, defenseman Ty Nelson. 64, centerman Servak Petrovsky. 63, left winger Mikey Milne. 62, centerman Damian Gardner. 61, right winger Vincenz Rohr. 60, centerman Jordan Gustafson. 59, left winger Michael Lastarza. 58, defenseman Michael Fisher. 57, centerman slash right winger Nicholas Moldenhauer. 56, defenseman Elias Salomonson. 55, centerman Bryce McConnell Barker. 54, forward Matthias Sapovalev. 53, centerman Pano Fimis. 52, defenseman Noah Warren. And 50, defenseman Sam Rinzel. Now, moving into our top 50, we have first, at number 50, centerman Philip Bystedt. Now, Bystedt I see as a physical, well-rounded player who has size, but really the one thing seriously holding him back from being higher on my board is his skating. If Bystedt could significantly improve his skating, I think he could be a top 6 forward in the NHL. At 49, we have defenseman Tristan Luneau. Now, Luneau is a guy that I think is very agile on his feet, and he has very good hands. He's a good puck handler. However, he is pretty slow, and he's not very good in transition, which is a pretty important role for defensemen in the NHL. So I don't think he has quite as much upside as people thought he had coming into this year. I could see him as a guy that could have some success on the power play, given his agility, his ability to open up passing lanes with his feet and his stick. But if you're looking for scoring at 5-on-5, I don't think Luno is a guy who's going to provide a ton of that. At 48, we have another defenseman in Elias Pettersson, and he's a guy that is pretty fast, strong. He brings a lot of physicality, but really the main thing holding him back is his offense. I don't think there's a ton of offensive upside there with Pettersson, but he could be a decent shutdown guy in the NHL. At 47, we have yet another defenseman in Kasper Kulonumi. I'm butchering that one. I apologize to my Finnish fans. But Casper, I'll just call him Casper, is a guy who I think is a very solid skater. He's good in transition as well. I think he's pretty agile and quick. But he's not a guy that I see has a ton of offensive upside either. He's a guy, though, that I think could put up a few points in the form of assists on rush chances and gaining the offensive zone on the cycle as a transition piece. At 46, we have centerman Paul Ludwinski. Now, Ludwinski is kind of an interesting player. He's pretty fast and he is quite physical. Those are his main traits. He can beat you in physical battles, despite the fact that he's only 5'11. So, if you like undersized physical forwards, then Ludwinski is a guy for you. At 45, we have centerman Danny Zilkin. Now, the best thing about Zilkin's game is his shot, but he's also a very good puck handler and a pretty good passer to boot. So overall, he's a pretty solid threat in the offensive zone, both to shoot himself and create chances for his teammates. So I don't think he's a guy who has a crazy amount of upside, but he could be one of the better third line scoring guys from this draft. At number 44, we have defenseman Matthias Havlid. Now, Havlid is a guy who is pretty agile with his feet. He's really good at opening up shooting lanes from the blue line by creating separation with his feet. And he likes to shoot the puck himself when he creates those shooting lanes. And he has a really good shot. As a defenseman, I don't really value having a great shot that highly, just because even in ideal circumstances for defensemen, their shooting percentage is always going to be lower than forwards because they're pretty much always going to be further away from the goal than a typical forward would be, unless that defenseman is Cale Makar. But he has a good shot and he likes to use it, so that's pretty much what you're getting with Havlin. At 43, we have forward Adam Ingram. Now, Ingram, I see as kind of a goal scorer, probably not a guy who puts up like a ton of goals in the NHL, maybe 10, 15 goals a season on average. But he is a guy that can occasionally score like a pretty goal scorer's goal, just a pure snipe. But he's also a guy that can get into physical areas right in front of the net, get a tip, get a rebound, that type of goal as well. So he kind of has a goal scorer's touch, which helps, and that is the most significant trait, I think, with Ingram. At 42, we have centerman Hunter Height, who is a average skater, but he's pretty dangerous with the puck on his stick, specifically in the offensive zone. He's a good passer, he's a good shooter, and he's a guy that I think might have top 6 upside if everything goes well with him. At 41, we have another centerman in Jack Hughes. Hughes is, I think, a pretty solid, well-rounded player this year. It's kind of hard to get a great read on him since he was playing in the NCAA, which is a bit unusual for a draft eligible player. But I will say he did put up pretty good production in the NCAA as a freshman against pretty much older and stronger opponents. So that is kind of impressive. At 40, I have another centerman in Yuri Kulik. Kulik's best trait to me is his skating. I think he's a very strong skater and he has an above average shot as well. And he is also pretty responsible defensively. So he's really a threat and to be impactful in all three zones. I think he can be decent in transition. He is a decent threat in the offensive zone, particularly to shoot, and he's reasonably defensively responsible as well. So you're getting a really solid, I think, 200-foot player with Kulik, uh, who could probably end up playing in a middle six role. At 39, we have defenseman Leon Bichelle. And Bichelle is one of the largest guys in the draft and one of the hardest hitting, most physical players in the draft. And he's also a pretty good skater. And I've said it before, I will say it yet again. If you're a defenseman, being big and being a good skater is a really, really good combo to have. Now, speaking of defensemen who are not big, we have at 38 Lane Hutson. So Hudson is a decent skater. He's very mobile, but he's not very fast. He lacks the separation speed, which is a problem for him. He is going to have to get faster. But if he can improve that, oh man, this guy could be one of the steals of the draft. I think Hudson is just an offensive dynamo. He's one of the best passers in the draft, not only in his physical execution of passes, but also in creating passing lanes and his vision. So he's a guy that I think could be one of the few defensemen that could run a top power play out of this draft. And not only that, I think if he hits and he develops well, he could be one of the better top power play guys to come out of this draft. So look out for Lane Hudson. At number 37, I have forward Julian Lutz. Now, Lutz is a guy who plays a pretty solid, well rounded game, who is physical and plays well under pressure as well. I don't think he's a guy with a ton of upside, but he is a guy who could be playing well in a solid bottom six role sooner than you might think. At number 36, I have centerman David Goyette. Now, Goyette is a very good playmaker who also has a potentially dangerous shot. His shot seems to improve quite a bit as the season went along, so I'd like to continue to see some improvement with his shot. But if he does, he could be a solid threat in the offensive zone. Again, not a guy that I think has a ton of upside, but maybe a third line guy who can score. At 35, I have defenseman Isaiah George. Now, George is a very good skater, and he's a bit of a defensive specialist. I think if he develops well, he could turn into a guy who plays a bit like Marc-Edouard Vlasic. Not the Vlasic of this last season or the last couple of seasons, but think of Marc-Edouard Vlasic in his prime. If you saw him during his prime, he was really one of the better shutdown defensemen in the league, and I think George could be a player like that. I don't think there's a ton of offense that he's going to bring to the NHL, though. At 34, I have centerman Owen Beck. Now, this might seem a bit low for Beck, but I just don't think he has quite the offensive upside to really put him much higher than this. But he's a very well-rounded player, arguably one of the best 200-foot players in this draft outside of Shane Wright. At 33, I have defenseman Christian Kyrou. Now, Kyrou is one of the best D-men in this draft class in terms of pure offensive upside. His defensive game is a bit problematic, just to say the least, and that could really hold him back from making the NHL at all. If he does make the NHL, though, he is probably not going to be a guy who's ever really going to be good on defense, but it's going to be because he is capable of running a top power play unit and putting, 45, 50 points up in a season. At 32, I have another defenseman in Ryan Chesley. Now, Chesley is very different from Kyrou. I think he's one of the better defensive defensemen in this draft class. He does have a little bit of offensive potential, nothing too crazy, but he could be a guy who maybe puts up 20 points a season or so. His skating, though, I think is really solid, which in my mind makes him a pretty safe bet. At 31, I have centerman Rucker McGroarty. McGroarty is a guy who has a lot of tools that I really like. He has a good shot. He has good vision. He's a good playmaker, a really good passer, can play physically. He's pretty much your prototypical power forward, but his skating is bad. Okay. His skating could hold him back really from I don't want to say playing in the NHL at all because I do think there's an NHL player there with McGroarty, but his real upside, I think, is probably as a second line center, almost like a Tomas Hertl type player. Maybe not quite as good as Hertl, but can fill that 2C role pretty well. But he's not going to get there unless his skating improves. At 30, I have Slovakian winger, I believe, uh, Adam Sikora, or Adam Sikora, I believe is how it is correctly pronounced. Sikora is an elite skater. That is the best part of his game in my mind. It is the physical trait that I value the most, particularly amongst defensemen, but also with forward skating is obviously really important. And he is one of the better skaters in this draft class. He also can play pretty physical despite his small size, and he plays at a really high pace. So even though he is not necessarily the most skilled guy in this draft class by any means, I don't think he has like any crazy passing or shooting skills. He could put up points simply by playing at a high pace and playing on a line with other guys who play at a similar pace to him, but are perhaps a bit more skilled. He could be a bit of a complementary guy, almost kind of like a Zach Hyman type player. Um, I kind of hate to compare players to Zach Hyman because I make a bad habit of doing it, but it's that type of role that I think fits Sakura well in the NHL. At 29, I have defenseman Seamus Casey. Casey is a guy that I think has a ton of offensive potential, but his skating needs to get better. I think he's a pretty risky pick because of his skating, but if he does improve his skating and he hits, he could be a decent top four defenseman that scores 30 to 40 points a season. At 28, I have centerman Connor Geeky. Now, the main things you need to know about Geeky are twofold. One, he's a really good playmaker. Two, he's a really bad skater. I think some people are not taking into consideration Geeky's skating as much with where they're ranking him. I would not be surprised to see him drafted a lot higher than this, but to me, the skating really makes him quite a risky pick. He will play in the NHL, but I think his upside is pretty limited. Maybe a third line center who can probably not score a ton of goals, but maybe give you 30, 35 assists a season from your third line, maybe getting a little bit of power play time. If his skating significantly improves, maybe he can be a second line center. But we'll see about that. At 27, I have defenseman Callie Odelius. He is arguably one of the best, if not the best, well-rounded defenseman in this draft class. He can play physically. He's defensively responsible. He's good at defending the neutral zone as well. I don't think he has a ton of offense to bring, though. I don't think he's a guy that's going to score a lot of points in the NHL. Probably not a guy who gets any power play time, but will be a solid contributor. At 26, I have defenseman Denton Mateychuk. Mateychuk has pretty good vision. He has a pretty good shot as well. And of course, he's a good passer. But his style of play, I don't think translates to the NHL very well. he frequently is playing more like a forward, like a winger, than he is a defenseman, which is going to irritate a lot of NHL head coaches, to say the least. I think if you want him to play in the NHL, you're probably going to want him to change the style of game he plays at least a bit. And I feel like that's asking kind of a lot from a prospect. At 25, I have left winger Ivan Miroshnichenko. So the main concern with Miroshnichenko is, of course, going to be his health. He did deal with Hodgkin's lymphoma this year, missed a large part of the season because of that, but he is in remission now, and he has been cleared to resume hockey activities. So it's kind of down to what teams thought that they saw out of him before he missed that time and how much his health questions are going to affect where they're going to draft him. He's a guy that I could see going top 20 just in terms of his pure talent. I think he's a really good skater and he has a really good shot, and those are really strong tools that you want to draft for. But he's also a guy that could draft outside the. I should say he's a guy that NHL teams could draft outside the first round. At 24, I have left winger Isaac Howard. Howard is a really good skater. He's really fast, and he has a very dangerous shot, which makes him a very dangerous threat to score, particularly on the rush. In my opinion, the NHL is becoming a league that is more and more about speed and creating chances off the rush. So I think Isaac Howard is a guy that fits into that very well. I'd be interested to see what type of team drafts him because I think he'd be very, very good on a team like, for example, the Colorado Avalanche. They kind of play the style of hockey that I think Howard plays as well. Of course, I don't think the Avalanche have much of a chance in drafting him, but we will see. At 23, I have centerman slash left winger Philip Massar. Now, Massar is a very good skater who uses crossovers to generate speed through the neutral zone. He's a solid puck handler as well, and is a guy who I think could have a top 6 upside. There's not a ton of guys who are going to go at this point in the draft or later that I do think have that much upside. And Massar is perhaps slightly less likely to play in a top 6 than a lot of other guys in this draft, but he is a guy who I think ceiling is that high. At 22, I have Marco Kasper, centerman from the SHL. I don't love Marco Kasper. I think he's a very well-rounded hockey player, very effective. He's kind of a net front guy in the offensive zone. Can get a tip, can get a rebound, can score kind of those greasy type of goals. Very physical. He is a power forward. Yeah, I think his upside is a little bit limited though, because I don't think he has any one skill that really stands out to me. No skills that really make me think this guy's gonna score a ton of points in the NHL. Maybe if everything goes perfectly, he can be a second line center, but I really see him as a third line center. At 21, I have another centerman in Nathan Goucher. Goucher is another physical power forward who is a pretty good skater as well. I think he's likely a third line center, but because of his skating, which I think is the main difference between him and a guy like Marco Kasper, I think he's a guy that could potentially play a second line center role. At number 20, I have defenseman Owen Pickering. Pickering is huge. He's physical. He's a pretty good skater as well, which again is a great fundamental quality in a defenseman. And he's a pretty good passer as well. I don't think he'll bring a ton of offense to the NHL, but he does have a little bit of offensive potential. At number 19, I have Russian right winger Danila Yurov. Yurov is a guy that I think is a bit of a Swiss Army knife type player. He can pretty much play in any role you would put a winger in, I think, and he would succeed. put him in the top 6, bottom 6, third line role, second line role, whatever it is. I think he'll play pretty well. Isn't going to blow anybody away, I don't think. But yeah, I think he's likely a middle 6 guy. But again, he can slot in pretty much wherever you put him, I think. At number 18, I have centerman Noah Ostlund. Ostlund is a dynamic, fast-paced, playmaking winger. Not winger. He's a center. I think he has tons of upside. One of the highest upside guys in the draft, but he is pretty risky. He's small and he gets beaten by bigger players a lot. He does have small player problems, and he will continue to have small player problems in the NHL. In fact, though, they will only get worse, which is really my main concern with Ostlund. How is he going to develop to resist pressure a little bit better? And yeah. At number 17, I have Ostlund's teammate, winger Liam Ogren. Ogren scored 1.98 points per game this year in the Swedish J20 League, and he has been compared to Timo Meier. I think his skating is the main reason that I have him as low as I do, but admittedly, perhaps I'm a little bit too low on this one. I'm having second thoughts about him, to be honest. At 16, I have defenseman Pavel Mintyukov. Mintyukov is arguably the best offensive defenseman in this draft class. However, his defensive game is absolutely non-existent, pretty much. That's a little bit harsh, but his defensive game is bad. That is the main risk with him. If you get him and he works, he's running your top power play. He's giving you at least 45 points a season, probably. If he doesn't work, he's not playing in the NHL. At 15, I have center/left winger Cutter Gauthier. Now, Gauthier is a power forward who has one of the best shots in this draft class, and that's really the main selling point for Gauthier. I do think he will be a center at the NHL level, and he's a pretty good skater as well, who is also a heavy hitter, which of course is typical of power forwards. At 14, I have right winger Jonathan Lekerimäki. He's another guy who has one of the best shots in the draft. I would say it's a bit better than Gauthier's. He can beat goalies from distance and pretty much wherever on the ice. If he's taking a shot, it's a threat to go in. But he does shoot the puck kind of too much, which sounds weird given that he has such a great shot. But there are definitely times where even if you have the best shot in the world, probably a better idea to pass. And he's the type of player who just shoots, which I don't hate, but it's a bit of a hockey IQ problem, I think, and it's going to limit his scoring potential in the NHL if he doesn't learn how to use his teammates a little bit better. At 13, I have another right winger in Joakim Kemell. And Kemell and Lekerimäki to me are actually relatively similar players. Kemell is another guy who has a great shot, perhaps slightly better than Lekerimäki's, but he also has shot selection problems. He does like to shoot the puck from pretty much anywhere on the ice, and that is the main downside. So the shot for these guys is kind of both a blessing and a curse at times. At 12, I have defenseman Kevin Korchinski. Now, Korchinski doesn't have much of a shot, but he is an elite passer. His great vision and hockey sense combined with his stick handling and passing ability makes him one of the legitimately best offensive defensemen in the draft. However, his defensive game will need quite a bit of work, and he will need to get a little bit better at protecting the puck when it's on his stick in order to truly work out at the NHL level. At 11, I have my personal favorite player in the draft class, right winger from the Moose Jaw Warriors, Jagger Firkus. Firkus to me, first of all, and this is the main selling point in his game, I think he has the best shot in the draft, bar none. He is also a pretty good skater, reasonably fast, and he is a threat as a playmaker as well. He attempts a lot of dangerous passes, although his completion rate on those passes isn't great. If he can improve that a little bit, and it has been improving throughout the season, his playmaking in general has been improving throughout this last season. I just think the tools are there for a legitimate top six winger who could score 30 goals in the NHL. Now, normally I don't do this, but before I get into my top 10, I would like to take a moment just to ask you guys, if you haven't liked the video already, please do give it a like. It really helps me out. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do consider subscribing. This video has been quite literally a headache to make, although I love making these types of videos. This one in particular was a lot of energy and time went into it, so if you would consider doing those two things, I greatly appreciate it. Now, moving into my top 10. At 10, I have Russian defenseman Vladimir Grudinin. Now, like Furcus, I do think this is a little bit of a hot take, but to me, Grudinin is the best skating defenseman in the draft, and I value that basically more than any other skill a defenseman could have. Now, of course, I wouldn't have him ranked this high if the rest of his skills were like mediocre. But I also think he's a reasonably good puck carrier who can play well in transition, and he's a pretty good passer who has a lot of offensive upside as well. Again, as a defenseman, I don't think he's going to score a lot of goals, which is, typical for defensemen in general. But there are exceptions like Cale Makar, and no, Grudinin is not going to be like the next Cale Makar, but he is a guy who I think could quarterback a top power play unit. And quite frankly, I don't know what other people are seeing in him that have them ranking him so low. His rankings are all over the place. Generally speaking, people tend to have him in the first round, but I know some people have him way outside the first round, and that is just a bit of a joke to me. I do realize that having him at 10 is really, really high on him, but I'm just really bullish on Grudinin in general, and you gotta have him at least in the first round. Come on. At number 9, I have another kind of controversial player, and man, I've got another one coming up after him as well. Jeez. And that is, of course, Gleb Trikazov. Trikazov is a guy who absolutely tore up the MHL this season, was lights out in the playoffs, absolutely dominant, and really he is a guy who is pure offense. You like watching players that are fun to watch? Well, Trikazov is that guy. Every time, it feels like every time he's in the offensive zone, he is making something happen, particularly, of course, when the puck is on his stick. He has a great shot, although I will admit MHL goalies are not the toughest goalies in the world to score on. He's a very good playmaker, though, which I think is a bit, I don't want to say underrated because everybody pretty much agrees that Trikazov has the offensive talent. Now, where the weakness in his game is, of course, on defense. His defensive involvement is just bad to non-existent. Even in the playoffs, every game I watched of his this year was in the playoffs, and I thought his defensive involvement in most games that I saw was very weak. At times, it was a bit better, but he's definitely not a player coaches are throwing over the boards late in the game when they have a lead. At number 8, I have Finnish forward Brad Lambert. Now, Lambert is arguably, potentially the best player in the draft. His combination of skill and speed, I think, is unmatched. And that combination is really deadly. He's a really good skater, which I honestly think his game projects to the NHL pretty well. Obviously, he did not put up a lot of points this year. in the Finnish league. And that is troubling, but I firmly believe in process over results, even when the results are this bad. And does it worry me a bit? Kind of, but ultimately, I'm still very confident that Lambert is going to be a very good player in the NHL. So to have him at 8 is low. I mean, it's higher than most people have him, but based off his potential, could end up looking a bit silly where he gets drafted this year. At number 7, I have Simon Nemec. Now, Nemec is the guy who has been touted as the best offensive defenseman in this draft class. And I think there's definitely a chance that that is true. Or at least 5 years from now, or 7 years from now, whatever, we're looking back at this draft class and we're saying, man, people were right. Nemec was the best offensive defenseman available. However, I also think there's a reasonable chance that his offense doesn't quite translate to the NHL as well as people might be expecting. I do think he will still be a top power play guy who at least puts up like 40 points a season, though. Now, my main concern with Nemec is actually his decision making, particularly with icings. This is just it's a small part of his game, but it's a really annoying thing when you see Nemec icing the puck over and over again, especially in instances where there's a pretty obvious pass that he just either misses or perhaps he's being lazy or I don't know, perhaps he feels some type of pressure that isn't really there. It's kind of weird and it really frustrates me at times, but that is kind of a nitpicky thing if that is your biggest concern with a player. Number 6, I have American forward centerman, even Frank Nazar. Nazar is a really fun player to watch. He's really fast, he's really gifted offensively, has a good shot, is a good playmaker, and really, I just think that kind of like a guy with Isaac Howard, the NHL is going more and more towards a high-paced, fast, skilled version of the game. And I think Nazar is the type of player that would absolutely thrive in that environment. At number 5, I have Winnipeg Ice centerman Matthew Savoy. Savoy is a guy who I've gone back and forth on all season. At the beginning of the season, I was like, wow, look at this guy. In the middle of the season, I guess I was a little bit more pessimistic, like, oh, he's small, he gets beaten off the puck a little bit too much. And then towards the end of the season, I kind of came back around on him. Savoy is the type of player who really thrives on the power play. A lot of his production this year came on the power play, and I think he'll be an excellent option on a top power play unit in the NHL. But I do think there's a bit more that you could get out of him 5-on-5 than he showed this season, particularly if he gets a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, a little bit better at resisting pressure and evading pressure entirely. Then I think you're looking at a guy who maybe doesn't play on the first line, particularly if he's playing as a center. He might not work as a center at the NHL level, though, because of his size. I could see him potentially being a top line winger, though. Either way, I think you're at the very least getting a top 6 player who puts up a lot of points. 4th overall, I have my favorite defenseman in this draft class, and that is David Jiricek. Jiricek is a guy who I don't think has a crazy high ceiling. He might not even be a top power play guy in the NHL. However, he's big, he's a good skater, and he just plays that really, he kind of plays an NHL playoff style of hockey, which I think is super valuable to any NHL team, especially in the playoffs, obviously. And I think it's a really safe floor, and he is still a guy who will put up points. I think you're probably getting like a second power play quarterback who maybe puts up 35 to 45 points a season. And yeah, that's about all I really have to say about David Jiricek. My third favorite player in the draft class, or third ranked player in the draft class, I should say, is centerman Logan Cooley. With Cooley, the ceiling is skyward, really. He has one of the highest, if not the highest, ceilings in the draft class. He's a really solid two-way player as well, I think. Not as much as a guy like Shane Wright. I think, generally speaking, where they're at now, Wright and Cooley are relatively similar players, although I think Cooley is a bit more flashy. He definitely makes more flashy plays. Maybe his positioning isn't quite as good as a guy like Shane Wright, but he's a guy that I definitely see highlighting NHL highlight reels a lot in his future. Finally, it comes down to the top two players, and there is a bit of controversy going on right now between these guys. Some people think it's Slafkovsky, some people think it's Wright, and well, I think it's Wright, which of course means that my second overall player is Yuri Slafkovsky. The main reason I don't have Slafkovsky going first overall is I am a bit skeptical of Slafkovsky's international success this season. Some of it came against very weak opponents, teams like Kazakhstan and France at the World Championships. Some of my concern is just based off of sample size. Some of it is based off of level of competition, even when he wasn't playing those teams. When he's playing, for example, the United States, there at the Olympics, for example, there were no active NHL players at the Olympics. So yes, there was lots of NHL talent at the games, but it's not the same as NHL level, in my opinion. So all those reasons combined with the fact that his season in the Finnish Liga wasn't that impressive, to me, keeps him from having the title as the best player in the draft. He is still a really good player, though, that any team would want to have him. He has a really good shot. I think he's going to score a lot of goals at the NHL level, and he's going to be a really solid player in general. But to me, Shane Wright, of course, is the best player available. He plays a very mature game, 200-foot player, although I do think his defensive game is a bit overrated. His positioning all over whatever end of the ice he's in is solid, and I think that's where he gets most of his value in the defensive zone is his positioning. He's good at staying in passing lanes and tying up guys in front of the net. He's not a guy that I think is going to blow anybody away in terms of his talent. He has a pretty dang good shot, and he could score 30 goals at the NHL level, maybe, but I don't ever see him really being, that close to a point per game player. Maybe like a 65, 70 point player, but I think that's about what you're getting with Shane Wright. Not a player that really blows you away in terms of first overall picks. Okay, guys, that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching to the end. You guys are seriously awesome. If you did like the video, again, please do give it a like. It really helps me out. All that good stuff. I'll put another video on the screen now if you want to check that one out. Tomorrow, guys, will be my ultimate guide to the 2022 NHL draft. So make sure you stick around for that. Subscribe if you have to, turn the notifications on, all that stuff. And until then, have a nice day.